Nobody wanted this car when it came out. Dealers couldn't sell it. Buyers ignored it. And most people didn't even understand why it existed in the first place. It looked aggressive. It sounded aggressive. It was expensive to own, expensive to insure, and completely out of sync with the world it was released into. And yet, today, that same car sells for millions of dollars at auction. Sometimes more than houses. More than supercars. More than anything anyone in 1971 could have realistically imagined. This is the story of the Plymouth Hemi Cuda. The muscle car that arrived at the worst possible moment. And became one of the most valuable cars ever built because of it. But to understand why it failed, you have to go back. Back to a time when failure like this was almost impossible. The late 1960s. When American car culture was at its absolute peak. When manufacturers weren't trying to be efficient or careful. They were trying to dominate. And dominating meant building cars that were louder, faster, and more powerful than anything that came before. Engines were growing in size. Horsepower numbers were climbing. And the competition between brands was turning into something close to an arms race. Every new model had to be better than the last. Not just slightly better, but dramatically better. Something that would grab attention instantly. And hold it. And for a while, it worked. People loved these cars. They lined up to buy them. They modified them. Raced them. Talked about them. Argued about them. And built entire identities around them. But while all of this was happening, something else was changing in the background. Something slower. Less visible. But just as important. Because by the time 1970 arrived, the environment that had allowed muscle cars to thrive was already starting to disappear. Insurance companies began increasing premiums on high-performance vehicles to levels that made them unaffordable for many younger drivers. And those younger drivers were exactly the audience that had driven the popularity of muscle cars in the first place. At the same time, the government started introducing new emissions regulations that forced manufacturers to rethink how engines were built. Compression ratios had to be reduced. Fuel mixtures had to change. And power outputs began to drop. And then there was fuel itself. Big V8 engines didn't just use fuel. They consumed it rapidly. And as fuel prices started to rise, and concerns about availability increased, these cars began to look less practical and less desirable. What had once been seen as exciting and powerful was now being seen as expensive and inefficient. And this shift didn't happen all at once. But it happened fast enough that by the early 1970s, the market had already started to move in a completely different direction. And this is exactly the moment when Plymouth made a decision that, in hindsight, seems almost unbelievable. Instead of adapting to these changes, instead of making something more efficient or more accessible, they decided to build one of the most extreme muscle cars ever created. The car started as the Barracuda, a relatively compact platform designed to compete with cars like the Mustang and Camaro. But Plymouth wanted something different. Something that would stand out. Something that would push the limits of what a street car could be. So they took that smaller body and installed one of the most powerful engines they had. The 426 Hemi. This engine wasn't originally designed for everyday driving. It was developed for racing. It was large, heavy, and incredibly powerful. Officially rated at 425 horsepower, but widely believed to produce significantly more. And putting that engine into a compact car created a very specific kind of experience. One that was intense, unpredictable, demanding. At idle, the car shook. The engine was always present, always noticeable. And when you pressed the accelerator, the response was immediate, forceful. There was no delay, no smoothing, no filtering. It was raw mechanical power, delivered directly to the driver. And that kind of experience required skill. It required attention. And it rewarded confidence. But it also made the car difficult for the average driver, especially at a time when other vehicles were becoming easier to operate, quieter, and more refined. And the design of the car reflected that same aggressive philosophy. The shaker hood scoop, mounted directly to the engine, moved as the engine ran, creating a visual connection between the machine and the driver. The stance was wide. The lines were bold. The colors were bright and impossible to ignore. And the side stripe became one of the most recognizable design elements of the era. Everything about the Hemi Cuda communicated power, intensity, attitude. But by the time it reached the market, that message no longer aligned with what most buyers were looking for. The world had changed. Priorities had shifted. And the demand for cars like this had already started to decline. So when the Hemi Cuda arrived in 1971, it didn't create excitement. It created confusion. The people who would have wanted it just a few years earlier were now dealing with higher insurance costs, stricter regulations, and changing economic conditions. And as a result, the car didn't sell. The production numbers tell the story clearly. What makes this story even more interesting is what happened next. Because when something fails in the market, it usually disappears quietly. People move on. Companies move on. And the product itself is forgotten. But cars like this don't disappear that easily. They remain somewhere, in garages, in storage, sometimes sitting untouched for years, sometimes being used without any thought of their future value. And that is exactly what happened with the Hemi Cuda. The few that were sold didn't immediately become collectibles. They became used cars. And used cars get treated very differently. They get modified, repainted, raced, sometimes crashed, sometimes neglected. And over time, the number of original, untouched examples starts to shrink. Not because they were rare to begin with, but because nobody thought they were worth preserving. And this creates something unique, a kind of rarity that wasn't planned. It just happened. And that kind of rarity often becomes the most valuable because it reflects real history, real usage, real loss. And as the years passed, and the muscle car era became something people looked back on instead of something they lived in, the perception of these cars began to change. Slowly at first, almost unnoticed. Enthusiasts started to search for original examples. Collectors started to pay attention. And the cars that had once been ignored started to gain a new kind of importance. Not because they were better than modern cars, but because they were different. In a way that could not be recreated. And that difference became more valuable over time. And this is where the Hemi Cuda gained a second life. Not as a product, but as a symbol. A symbol of an era when cars were built with a completely different philosophy. When the goal wasn't to isolate the driver, but to connect them directly to the machine. And that is something you can't replicate. And that's why a car nobody wanted became a legend.